Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the opening paragraph of his most famous book, The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump writes that deals are my art form. Other people paint beautifully on canvas or write wonderful poetry. I like making deals. The president says that his latest work, entitled Ukraine, hasn't quite come together yet. But I've no doubt that if asked, he would describe his plan as the geopolitical equivalent of the Mona Lisa. Anxious critics, including Europe's leaders, worry that what's coming out of the White House is actually a work of Pollock's. That's the great artist Jackson Pollock, of course. But as Mr. Trump points out in his book, while to some the Americans' canvases may look like someone just flung a pot of paint at the wall, his picture, number 17A, did sell for $200 million in 2016. Mr. Zelensky says he'll wait to see the completed work, though he fears that Ukraine may be forced to choose between its allies and its dignity. Mr. Putin seems to like it already, but he'll no doubt have some suggestions for improvement. He always does. So perhaps there's a way to go on this one. All the same, wishful thinking perhaps, but could this be the beginning of the end to this dreadful war? Right now, to Zelensky, it probably looks less like a deal and more like a surrender. And if there is a work of art that truly captures what is taking place in Ukraine right now, it is probably Picasso's horrific picture of slaughter of the innocents by fascists in the Spanish Civil War, Guernica. Let's start with the government this morning. A few moments ago, I spoke to the Transport Secretary. Heidi Alexander, when you discussed the proposed Ukraine peace deal at the Cabinet last week, what was the prevailing view?
So, Trevor, like many of your viewers, I learnt about the peace deal yesterday that President Trump was putting forward. I know that the Prime Minister spoke to President Trump yesterday, as well as President Zelensky. Clearly, it's been a harrowing conflict, and we need to find a way to secure that ceasefire and open up space for meaningful negotiations. There's clearly important meetings that are happening today in Geneva with the National Security Advisors. Jonathan Powell will be there for the UK, with the US counterparts and national security advisors from other European countries, as well as from Ukraine. And our fundamental view on this is the future of Ukraine has to be determined by Ukrainians themselves. But we do need to find a way to bring this conflict to an end and to secure that just and lasting peace that everyone wants.
I'll come into the substance of it in a moment, but okay, I can understand that maybe the Cabinet didn't know, but presumably the Prime Minister was warned this was coming.
So the Prime Minister has a very close relationship with President Zelensky and works closely with Donald Trump on this, because the only way that we're going to actually get a resolution to this conflict is by international powers working together to put pressure on Russia. There's been one side in this conflict, Trevor, that could... There's one side.
That's not quite the same thing as saying he was consulted before.
There's one side in this conflict, Trevor.
Here's a question that should keep every British taxpayer wide awake tonight. When the most consequential peace plan in a generation landed on the world stage, did our government actually have a seat at the table? Or were they reading about it on their phones, same as the rest of us? Because what unfolded on Sunday morning television wasn't just awkward TV. It was a masterclass in exactly what is wrong with British politics right now. A sweeping American proposal on Ukraine, 28 points, headlines exploding across every network. And when Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander was asked point blank whether the Cabinet had any prior warning, the answer, buried beneath layers of careful language, was essentially, "We found out when you did." Let that sink in. The United Kingdom, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of Ukraine's most vocal backers, a country that has committed billions in military and financial support, apparently learned about a landmark peace proposal from the news cycle. Not the diplomatic back channel, not a briefing, the news. Now, the government will push back on that framing. They'll point to Keir Starmer's phone call with Trump, they'll mention Jonathan Powell flying to Geneva, they'll invoke the so-called coalition of the willing, like it's a magic phrase that dissolves all scrutiny. But here's the political reality. Being consulted after a deal goes public is not consultation. It's damage limitation wearing a suit. And this matters far beyond the diplomatic optics. Because the central question hanging over Ukraine right now is the one that Europe's leaders are genuinely terrified to answer aloud. If America steps back, if Trump decides the bill is too high and the appetite too low, can Europe actually fill that void? The tanks, the intelligence, the sustained military commitment? When that question was put directly to the Transport Secretary 3 times, the answer never arrived. Just ceasefire language, Geneva references, and the word dialogue doing a lot of very heavy lifting. The British public aren't naive. They understand that some things can't be said in a Sunday morning studio. But there's a difference between diplomatic caution and transparent evasion. And right now, those lines are blurring in ways that erode public trust at precisely the moment when trust is most needed. And then there's the domestic swerve. Rail fares frozen for the first time in 3 decades, genuinely welcome news for commuters. But the moment the conversation shifted to fuel duty, to the 9 out of 10 journeys made by car, the ministerial pivot was so smooth it could have been choreographed. 4 questions, 4 non-answers. The 2/3 of Britain who drive to work apparently didn't make the talking points memo. And the 2-child benefit cap, a policy that has become the defining fault line within Labour itself, produced perhaps the most polished deflection of all: task forces, free breakfast clubs. The language of compassion without the commitment of policy. Here's what Sunday Morning actually revealed: a government that is competent at managing information but increasingly uncomfortable with answering for it.